You are legally incapacitated. We control everything now. My daughter-in-law's Christmas gift was a death sentence to my freedom. While my son stood by in cowardly silence, they thought they had won. But they forgot one thing. My mind is still my deadliest weapon. One phone call was all it took to dismantle their world. Watch how a hunter becomes the prey by Wednesday. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories about men who take revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Raymond Forrester. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, a place where the sun shows up for work every single day, and the winters feel like what the rest of the country calls a pleasant Tuesday in October. I spent 22 years as an independent business consultant, specializing in small business mergers and acquisitions. I'm semi-retired now, which mostly means I work when I choose to and ignore my phone when I don't. My mind is still sharp, sharper than some people would prefer. As it turns out, I live alone in a 3-story house on Cactus Road. 800 square feet of tile floors, tall ceilings, and a garage where I keep my Celestron Nexstar 8 SE telescope pointed at a narrow window. I cut through the shelving just for that purpose. I keep an observation journal on the kitchen table. It's a plain black notebook about the size of a hardback novel, and it contains 4 years of nightly notes, star coordinates, atmospheric conditions, what I saw, what I missed. Most people who visit glance at it and assume it's a diary. It isn't, but I suppose a record of what you're actually looking at, rather than what you wish you were seeing. Qualifies as 1. My son, David, moved into my house with his wife, Nicole. About 2 years ago, the arrangement was described to me as temporary. I want to be precise about that word because it's doing an enormous amount of work in this story. Temporary, I was told, while they sorted out their finances. Temporary while the housing market was so unpredictable. Temporary while they figured things out. I'm not sure what figured out means when you're 38 years old with a salary of $87,000 a year. But I didn't push. David is my son. You don't push. I should tell you about David as he used to be, because the person who stood in my living room that Christmas morning and the boy I raised are not the same person. The boy I raised used to wait up for me when I worked late. He'd fall asleep on the couch with the TV on, and I'd carry him to his room, and he'd always wake up just enough to say something half-formed and nonsensical. Something like, "The stars are loud tonight, Dad." Before going right back under, that boy asked questions about everything. That boy had a spine. The man he became is quieter in a different way. Not thoughtful quiet, managed quiet, like someone who has learned that speaking costs more than staying silent and has decided the savings are worth it. He works as a senior business development manager at a regional logistics company called Swift Route Logistics over on 48th Street. He dresses well, drives a leased car, and carries approximately $134. 0 inches credit card debt across 2 accounts, something I didn't know until later, but which explained a great deal in retrospect. And then there's Nicole Forster, Nick Castillo, 35 years old. Works as an administrator at a private clinic called Sonoran Wellness Center on Thomas Road. She is organized the way a surgical instrument tray is organized. Everything in its place. Everything with a purpose. Nothing left out by accident. She speaks to me in complete sentences with appropriate punctuation. She remembers details. She asked follow-up questions. In another context, I might have found that impressive. What I actually found over 2 years of living under the same roof was a pattern. Nicole would mention the house in ways that weren't quite questions. She'd say things like, "You've kept this place so beautifully maintained, Raymond. It would be such a shame to ever see it change hands." Or she'd ask with perfect casualness whether I kept important documents anywhere specific, because she wanted to make sure nothing got misplaced if anything ever happened. The first time I noted it, the second time I filed it, the third time, and there was a third time, I started paying a different kind of attention. I never said anything, not directly. That's not my style. I'm the kind of man who reads the whole contract before picking up the pen. And I'd rather spend an hour being certain than 30 seconds being wrong. Christmas morning arrived the way it always does in Scottsdale. Dry and bright. 62 degrees by 80 inches the morning. The light coming in flat and clear through the south-facing windows. I had coffee going. I had a small tree in the corner of the living room. Mostly for my own amusement. Decorated with a handful of ornaments that had been in a box in my closet since my wife and I bought them at a craft fair 20 years ago. I was standing at the kitchen counter reading the paper when I heard Nicole's footsteps on the stairs. Not the shuffle of someone still half asleep on a holiday. Measured steps. Deliberate. She came into the kitchen holding a large manila envelope. David was 2 steps behind her. He had his hands in the pockets of his jeans. And he was looking at a spot somewhere between the floor and the wall. Not at me. Not at Nicole. Just at that neutral middle distance that tells you everything about a man's conscience. Nicole set the envelope on the counter in front of me with both hands. Flat. The way you'd present something official, not a gift. A delivery. Raymond. She said. There are some documents here you need to look at. I set down my coffee cup. Good morning to you. 2. Nicole. She didn't smile. Your doctor signed off on a full evaluation. The assessment is formal. It confirms that you're legally incapacitated. We've already had it reviewed. She paused for exactly the right amount of time. That means we're now authorized to manage your finances and your property. All of it. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at David. He nodded. One small, miserable nod. Like a man confirming his own conviction. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the boy who talked in his sleep about loud stars. I thought about 22 years of building something so that the people I loved would be secure. I thought about the word temporary and how much it had always been a courtesy. I extended to people who had no intention of extending anything back. Then I picked up the envelope, tucked it under my arm, and said, "Thank you. I'll read it." Nicole looked faintly surprised. She'd expected something. Argument. Confusion. Distress. She got none of those things. David finally looked at me. And what I saw in his face wasn't satisfaction. It was relief, mixed with something he couldn't quite suppress. Something that looked almost like shame. Almost. I finished my coffee. I wished them both a Merry Christmas. Then I went upstairs, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. I read the documents that night. All of them. Twice. I've spent more than 2 decades reviewing contracts, partnership agreements, acquisition terms, liability clauses. I've sat across tables from people who thought complexity was the same thing as protection. And I've watched their faces when I found the one line that unraveled everything. Reading is for me what some people would call a professional superpower and what I would call plain patience. You slow down. You don't skim. You don't assume. The first thing I noticed was the physician's name at the bottom of the cognitive incapacity assessment, Dr. Craig Messer. Sonoran Wellness Center. 1380 West Thomas Road. The same clinic where Nicole worked as an administrator. I noted that. I kept reading. The second thing I noticed was the date of the examination listed on the assessment, December 18th. I sat with that date for a moment. Then I walked to my filing cabinet, opened the second drawer, and pulled out a folder I keep for business travel. Inside was a registration badge and a printed ticket from a professional conference I attended in Tempe, a 2-day event that ran December 18th and 19th. I had checked in on the 18th. My name was on the badge. My signature was on the sign-in sheet I'd photographed out of habit. I had not, in any version of physical reality, been at Sonoran Wellness Center on that date. I noted that, too, the third thing was smaller, but in some ways the most telling. 3 things. 3 separate structural failures in documents that were supposed to erase my autonomy and hand a $1 million estate to 2 people who had not paid for a single square foot of it. I wrote all 3 down in my observation journal. The same notebook that sat on my kitchen table, that Nicole had walked past at least 200 times. There's a certain satisfaction in that detail that I won't pretend to be above. I thought about David while I was writing. I'd been trying not to. But that's the problem with the past. It doesn't wait for an invitation. I remembered a Sunday afternoon about 15 years back, before David met Nicole, when he drove 3 hours to help me repaint the garage. We spent the whole day out there with brushes and a radio turned to a jazz station neither of us particularly loved. And we talked about almost nothing of consequence. His job at the time, a book I was reading, the way the monsoon season was changing. At one point, he knocked over a full tray of paint onto my shoes, and we both laughed so hard we had to sit down on the driveway. He was a good man that day. Easy to be around. The kind of company that doesn't require effort. The version of David who stood in my kitchen that morning, hands in pockets, staring at the middle distance while his wife handed me a forged assessment of my own mind. That person had arrived so gradually that I couldn't point to a single moment when the change happened. That's how it usually works. Not a door slamming, but a slow drift of the hinge. I tried to remember the last real conversation we'd had. Not logistics. Not, the water heater is making a noise. Or, I'll be home late. But an actual exchange of one person's thinking with another person's thinking. I couldn't find one. It had been over a year. Maybe longer. At some point, David had stopped being present in the house the way a person is present and started being there the way furniture is there. Available. Inert. Occupying space. And Nicole had filled everything he vacated. She was, I had to admit, extremely good at what she did. The documents were well prepared, not perfect, as I just demonstrated to myself, but well prepared. The timeline had been thought through. The choice of physician was deliberate, a doctor from inside her professional orbit, someone she had access to and presumably something over. The power of attorney paperwork had the right general structure. If I had been who she apparently believed I was, a bewildered old man too proud to admit his faculties were slipping, those documents might have been enough. That was the miscalculation. Not the specifics, but the premise. She'd built the entire structure on a foundation of who she thought I was. The next morning, I was up before 6:00. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my observation journal open to a fresh page. I wrote 3 column headings across the top. What I know, what I can prove, what I need. Under each one, I began making a list. The kitchen was quiet, the December light just starting to come in flat through the windows. And somewhere above me, I could hear the creak of footsteps, David or Nicole moving around, living the first morning of what they believed was a new arrangement. I finished my coffee. Then I picked up my phone and called the offices of an attorney I'd found through the Arizona State Bar referral service. The earliest appointment available was 2 days out. I took it. I was putting on my jacket to go to the hardware store. I needed a specific connector for the telescope mount, one I'd been meaning to pick up for weeks. When David appeared at the bottom of the stairs, he looked at me in a way I recognized from when he was young and had broken something and was trying to gauge how much I already knew. "You seem okay," he said. I'm okay," I said. Nicole thought. He stopped. Started again. "We just want what's best for—" "I'm going to the hardware store," I said. "Do you need anything?" He didn't answer. I buttoned my jacket and left. That evening, when I came back, I noticed that the look on Nicole's face when I walked in was the particular look of a person who has rehearsed one version of a conversation and is finding that the script doesn't match. She watched me move through the kitchen. She watched me make dinner. She watched me read. I gave her nothing to work with. No anger, no confusion, no visible distress. After they'd gone upstairs, even to my desk, I opened my laptop, pulled up the scanned copies of all the documents, and saved them to a flash drive I keep in the back of the filing cabinet. I put the drive in my jacket pocket. Then I checked my calendar for the next 2 days and thought about what exactly I was about to do. Some machines, when you look at them closely enough, show you exactly where the gears are exposed. I closed the laptop and went to bed at 10:00. I had a long week ahead of me, and I intended to be rested for it. 2 days after Christmas, I drove into Phoenix. The office building at 2100 North Central Avenue is a clean one. 2 Story structure with a lobby that smells like recycled air and ambition. Suite 501 is on the 5th floor. A frosted glass door. A small waiting area with 2 chairs and a side table holding magazines from 3 months ago. And a receptionist who looked up when I walked in and said, "Mr." Forster without me having to introduce myself. I appreciated that. It told me the attorney ran a tight operation. Pamela Diaz came out to meet me herself. Société. Compact. With a kind of focused attention that made you feel like the only case in the building, she shook my hand, gestured toward her office, and closed the door behind us before I'd even settled into the chair. I handed her the flash drive. She plugged it into her laptop without comment and started reading. I sat across from her desk and looked at the framed certificates on the wall. Arizona State Bar. Family and Civil Law. A commendation from a legal aid organization I recognized. I didn't say anything. I've sat in enough rooms with enough professionals to know that the ones worth their rate don't need to be filled with conversation. 40 minutes passed. She made 3 handwritten notes on a yellow legal pad. She scrolled back twice. Then she looked up. "This is a forgery," she said. "Not a question." I know. The notary's certification number doesn't exist in the state registry. I just checked. She turned the laptop slightly so I could see the screen. The Arizona Notary Public Database. The search field. The 0 results. The physician's name is Craig Messer at Sonoran Wellness Center. Do you know that clinic? My daughter-in-law works there. She's the administrator. Pamela wrote something on the legal pad and underlined it. And the examination date listed in the assessment. Were you available on that date? I was at a professional conference in Tempe. I have the badge, the registration ticket, and a photograph from the sign-in sheet. She put down the pen. "Mr. Forster, I want to be direct with you. These documents are flawed enough to challenge, but the window matters. Once they file with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, and given that they handed these to you 2 days ago, they may already be planning to. The process of unwinding it becomes more complicated. Not impossible, but more complicated. What do you recommend?" 2 simultaneous tracks. She held up one finger. "First, we file a special action petition with the Arizona Supreme Court to challenge the validity of the power of attorney and the incapacity determination. Special action is an emergency procedure. It moves faster than standard civil litigation and is appropriate here because the harm is ongoing and immediate. Second finger. At the same time, I file a formal complaint with the Arizona Medical Board against Dr. Messer. A physician who signs a fraudulent capacity assessment is looking at license suspension and potentially criminal referral. That creates pressure from a completely separate direction. Timeline. The special action filing can go in within the week. Medical board complaints typically take longer. But the submission itself is immediate and becomes part of the public record. She paused. My retainer is $7. $500 to start. $250 per hour after that. I'll need a signed engagement letter today if you want me to begin on the spot. I paid the retainer from my personal account. She provided the engagement letter. I signed it. We spent another 30 minutes going through the 3 evidentiary points I'd identified. She added a 4th I hadn't considered. Under Arizona law, a valid durable power of attorney requires the principal to be of sound mind at the time of signing, and since no signing had actually occurred, the document was not merely flawed, but structurally void. By the time I left, it was past noon, and the sun was doing what it always does in December in Scottsdale, sitting low and flat in the sky, throwing long shadows across the parking structure. I sat in my car for a moment and looked at the receipt for the retainer check. Tsimeyan. Wubei. A fair price for someone putting a wall between me and 2 people who had decided my life was available for redistribution. I drove home along Camelback Road, taking the longer route without particularly planning to, somewhere around 32nd Street. My phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. A call inquiry on my account. Flagged because I'd set up an alert system 2 years ago after a round of phishing attempts that came through an email that looked almost exactly like my bank's standard correspondence. Almost is a word that requires attention. The alert showed that someone had called the bank's main line and identified themselves as an authorized representative of Raymond Forrester, requesting current balance information on my primary checking account and my investment account. The representative on record had declined to provide the information because the caller could not supply the secondary verbal confirmation code, a 6-digit sequence I'd established specifically for account inquiries. I sat at a red light and thought about that for a moment. Then I pulled into a gas station on the right, called my bank directly, confirmed with the representative that the inquiry had indeed been declined, and added a secondary restriction: any changes to account structure, beneficiary designations, or access levels now required an in-person visit with 2 forms of identification. I also upgraded the verbal confirmation code. When I got home, the house was quiet. David's car was in the driveway. Nicole's was gone. I put my jacket on the hook inside the front door and walked to the kitchen. The observation journal was where I'd left it, open to the page with my 3-column headings from 2 nights ago. I read through what I'd written and added a 4th line under what I know. She tried the bank today. There's a particular kind of cold calculation in that action that I found clarifying, not an impulsive move. You don't call a bank 2 days after handing someone forged documents unless it's part of a sequence you've already planned. She had a timeline. She was working it. Good. So was I. I heard David on the stairs around 40 inches the afternoon. He came into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and stood at the counter, looking out the window. I was at the table reviewing some consulting notes I'd been meaning to finalize for a client engagement in Tucson. Nicole's at the clinic. He said, "Late meeting. Is she?" He turned the glass in his hands. You're very calm." "I'm usually calm. I mean about everything." I looked up from my notes. David had his eyes on the window, and the expression of a man who had made a decision he was still rehearsing justifications for. He was 38 years old and looked, in that moment, about 15, not in a sympathetic way, in the way that happens when someone reverts to the emotional age at which they stop developing accountability. "David," I said, "is there something you want to say to me?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Nicole says this is the right move for everyone." I closed the folder of consulting notes. Nicole says a lot of things. I stood up, took my coffee cup to the sink, and rinsed it. "Let me know if she needs anything from the store." I went upstairs. That evening I found a letter in the mailbox, return address Diaz and Associates. Suite 501, 2100 North Central Avenue, Phoenix, which was, of course, my own attorney's office. I'd had Pamela send a formal notice of representation to the address on file for the durable power of attorney document, which was my home address. Standard procedure. The letter was sitting in the mailbox because Nicole checks the mail every day at 530, and this was 545. I know what she read. I know because I drafted the language with Pamela that afternoon. Notice of contested legal instrument and pending special action petition. 8 sentences. Precisi. Formal. The kind of language that means exactly what it says and nothing more. I didn't see Nicole's face when she read it. I was upstairs, but I heard the front door close with more force than usual, and then a silence that had a specific texture, the silence of someone reassessing. I sat down at my desk and opened my observation journal. Under what I need, I crossed off the first item on the list and wrote the word done. 2 days later, I drove to a coffee shop near Sky Harbor Airport. I want to be clear about Gordon Wallace because people tend to assume that a man my age in a situation like this must have had some long-time confidant, a college roommate, a childhood friend, someone who's known him for 30 years and owes him a favor. That's not how this worked. Gordon and I met at an industry conference 4 years ago. Fell into a conversation about franchise valuation during a break between sessions, and discovered we operated in adjacent professional spaces. He's a transaction consultant, primarily on the acquisition side. We've referred clients to each other twice. We email occasionally. We have coffee when something professionally interesting comes up. I called him because he was competent, because he had no personal stake in my situation, and because I needed a specific kind of mind, one that approaches problems the way an accountant approaches a discrepancy. Find the number that doesn't match. Then trace backward until you find out why. He was already seated when I arrived, with a notebook open and a cup of black coffee he hadn't touched yet. Gordon is 64, lean, with silver hair kept short, and a habit of holding his pen between two fingers, even when he isn't writing. In the way some people hold a cigarette. He watched me sit down without saying anything, which I've always appreciated about him. Tell me what happened, he said. I told him all of it. The documents, the 3 structural failures, the bank inquiry, the attorney. I didn't editorialize. I gave him the sequence and the facts, and let him process. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he put down his pen and looked at the table for a moment. Your son works at Swiftroot Logistics, he said. Senior Business Development Manager. 3.5 years. Gordon nodded slowly. Swiftroot is registered in Arizona. Their incorporation documents are public through the Arizona Corporation Commission. Articles of incorporation. List of directors. Partnership agreements. Registered agent. All of it accessible online. He paused. I may have pulled them already. I looked at him. When? Yesterday morning after you called. He opened the notebook and turned it so I could read the top page. A summary of a company structure written in Gordon's precise, small handwriting. 34 pages of filings. Standard regional logistics operation. Privately held. Incorporated 6 years ago. 3 founding members on the articles. Current board has 2 managing directors. He tapped the page. One of the founding investors is a private equity fund. Meridian Growth Partners. Mid-size. Phoenix-based. They hold a 40% equity stake in SwiftRoute. He turned to page 11 of his notes. A name. I looked at it. I knew that name. Not well. Not personally, but professionally. In the way that you accumulate a directory of people who operate in your general sphere over 2 decades. The managing partner of Meridian Growth Partners had attended 2 of the same industry events I had. We had exchanged cards. We had never done business. But I knew his reputation, which was the important thing. Meticulous, returns-driven, deeply averse to any association with legal or reputational risk. Gordon was watching me read. You know him, he said. It wasn't a question. I know of him. I looked up. A company with active litigation risk attached to one of its senior managers. How does that typically land with a 40% equity stakeholder? Gordon considered this with the expression of a man doing math he'd already done. If the litigation is serious enough to create reputational exposure, a careful investor would want that resolved quickly. I picked up my phone. The coffee shop around us had the low ambient noise of mid-morning. Espresso machines. Background conversation. A kid at the next table doing homework on a laptop. Normal sounds. I found the number I was looking for in my contacts under a name I'd filed there after a conference 2 years ago and never used. Gordon said, Raymond. Are you sure about this? I looked at him. I'm making one call. I said, to ask one question. I pressed dial. The phone rang twice. This is Raymond Forrester. I said when it connected, I'm a business consultant based in Scottsdale. We've met briefly at the Southwestern Business Development Summit 2 years ago. I believe. I apologize for calling without more notice. I paused to let the recognition settle. I have a professional question regarding a portfolio company. It concerns a potential liability situation that may not have surfaced yet at the investor level. I thought you'd want to know before it became something more visible. There was a short silence on the other end. Then, what company? I told him. I gave him the name, the manager's position, and one sentence describing the nature of the pending legal matter, not the personal details. The professional exposure, the kind of liability that a carefully run equity fund actively monitors. He asked 2 follow-up questions. I answered both. Factually. Without speculation. I appreciate the call. He said. His voice was even, but the even tone of someone who had just added something to a list. I'll look into it. I'm sure you will. I said. Good morning. I set the phone down on the table. Gordon was looking at me with the expression he gets when he's recalibrating an assessment. That was it, he said. That was it. I picked up my coffee. Information tends to do its own work once it's in the right hands. The question is just whether the hands you give it to have any reason to act on it. Gordon thought about that for a moment, then wrote something in his notebook and closed it. We talked for another 20 minutes about a separate client matter he'd been working on, a manufacturing acquisition in Tucson that had stalled over an earn-out dispute. Normal conversation. The kind you have when the immediate business is settled. I drove home along the 10. The midday traffic moving cleanly in the January dry air. The mountain ranges were sharp on the horizon the way they only get in winter. When the heat haze is gone and you can see all the way to the detail, I thought about what I had done, and what I still needed to do, and in what order. The legal track was moving. Pamela had the 3 evidentiary points in the engagement letter. The medical board complaint was being drafted. The bank was locked down. The professional track had just been set in motion with a single phone call, and one question. There was one more thing I needed. Not urgently, but with the kind of patience that produces results. I needed to understand the full scope of what Nicole and Dr. Messer had actually built together, because what I could see from the outside of the Sonoran Wellness Center arrangement was only the part that faced me. The part of an iceberg that faces you is rarely the part that matters. I knew a private investigator. Not personally. I'd found his name through the Arizona Department of Public Safety's Licensed Investigator Registry, which lists every currently certified private investigator in the state. I had written down 3 names from the registry 2 days earlier after doing a brief search on each one. The one I intended to call was Brad Coleman, 55 years old, licensed for 9 years, formerly with an insurance investigation firm before going independent. Insurance background meant he knew how to trace paper. That was what I needed. I made a mental note to call him the following morning. When I got home, the house was quiet. I went to the garage, uncovered the telescope, and spent 40 minutes recalibrating the mount's polar alignment, something I'd been meaning to do since early December, when I'd noticed a slight drift in my tracking. It was precise, tedious work that required full attention and a steady hand. Exactly the kind of work I needed. The stars wouldn't be visible for hours yet, but the calibration would be done, and when the sky was ready, so would I. That's the thing about preparation. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. To anyone watching, the man adjusting the telescope in his garage is just an old man with a hobby. That's fine. Let them think so. The new year arrived in Scottsdale the way it always does, quietly, without ceremony. The temperature dropping to 51 degrees overnight while the rest of the country was buried under weather that actually qualified as winter. I had gone to bed at a reasonable hour, slept without difficulty, and woke up to a kitchen that smelled like coffee I hadn't made yet. I was standing at the counter waiting for the pot to finish when I heard David on the stairs. Not his usual measured descent. Something faster, slightly off rhythm, the sound of a man who has received information he doesn't yet know what to do with. He came into the kitchen holding his phone. He was still in the clothes he'd slept in, and his face had the specific quality of someone who has read something twice and is hoping the second reading will produce a different result. "There's a letter," he said. "Good morning, David." He looked at me. "It's from Swift Root HR. He turned the phone so I could see the screen. Though I didn't move to look. "They're eliminating my position. Effective 3 days ago. They backdated it to the 31st. I poured my coffee. "That's an interesting timeline. They're calling it a restructuring." His voice had gone careful in the way voices do when the speaker is simultaneously trying to process and perform calm. "Senior Business Development Manager. They say the role is being absorbed into regional operations." He paused. 6 weeks. Severance. Nicole appeared in the doorway behind him. She was fully dressed, which told me she'd been awake for a while, and her expression had the compressed quality of someone managing an internal temperature that was rising faster than she would prefer. The 3 of us stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the particular silence of people who are all thinking about the same thing and choosing different versions of whether to say it. Nicole said it. "Did you do this?" I picked up the newspaper that was folded on the counter and opened it to the middle section. "Good morning, Nicole." "Raymond." Her voice was flat and precise. "I'm asking you a direct question. Did you make a call that affected David's employment?" I looked up from the paper. I took a moment, not for effect, but because I wanted to be accurate. "I made one call," I said. "A few days ago to a professional contact. We discussed a business matter that was relevant to his portfolio." I set the paper down. Decisions about employment are made by employers. I'm not anyone's HR department. David said. What does that mean? It means that information, when it reaches the right people, tends to produce its own results. I picked up my coffee. Business decisions are made by business people. David. That's how it works. He stared at me. The composure he'd walked in with was developing cracks at the edges, not breaking, but visibly stressed, like a surface that hadn't quite failed yet. You had me fired. I had a conversation. I moved toward the doorway. Now you have time. I'd suggest using some of it to look carefully at the paperwork you handed me last week. Some of those documents have issues that are going to require attention. I left the kitchen. Behind me, I heard Nicole's voice. Low, controlled. The voice she uses when she is recalculating rather than reacting. I didn't stop to listen. I had an appointment to get to. Brad Coleman's office was not impressive, which I had expected and didn't hold against him. It was a single room on the second floor of a shared professional building near Camelback Road. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and a window that faced west and would be unpleasant in the afternoon heat. He was 55, with the compact build of someone who spent time on his feet, and the eyes of someone who had spent more time than that reading things people would prefer he hadn't. We'd spoken once on the phone. Meeting in person confirmed my initial read. Careful, direct, without the self-promotional overlay you sometimes get from professionals in visible industries. I explained what I needed, not the personal history, just the professional parameters. I wanted to understand the full operational relationship between Nicole Forrester and Dr. Craig Messer at Sonoran Wellness Center. I wanted to know whether their arrangement was limited to the document they'd used against me or whether it was something larger. I gave him the clinic address, both names, and the dates of the forged assessment. He listened without writing anything down until I finished. Then he wrote one line in a notepad, tore it off, and slid it across the desk. His rate, $200 per hour, minimum à zéro. Hour engagement up front. Min R-Mayuan. 000 to start. I wrote him a check on the spot. Insurance background, I said. He nodded. 8 years at a claims investigation firm before going independent. Most of my work now is civil. Business disputes. Asset verification. Due diligence. Occasionally domestic. He looked at the check. What's your timeline? I need to understand what I'm dealing with before I hand anything to my attorney. She's already filed a special action on the documents. And there's a medical board complaint pending against Messer. But I want to know whether what she did to me is an isolated event or part of a pattern. Coleman nodded slowly. If there's a pattern, it'll show up in the billing records. Clinics, that size file claims electronically. The paper trail exists. It's just not public. Takes some access and some time. How much time? 2 to 3 weeks for an initial picture. Could be less if the structure is simple. I told him that was acceptable. We shook hands and I left. That evening, Nicole was on the phone in the upstairs hallway for nearly an hour. I could hear the cadence of it from the kitchen. Not the words, just the rhythm of someone managing a situation that is spreading outward from where it was contained. She was good at this. I'd give her that. Most people, when the board shifts under them, either freeze or overreact. Nicole did neither. She recalculated. What she hadn't accounted for was that the board had been shifting longer than she knew and in more directions than she was watching. I made dinner, ate it at the kitchen table with the observation journal open to a recent page, and went to bed at 10:00. By the time I woke up the next morning, David had been unemployed for 24 hours. My attorney had a special action petition in process. My private investigator had a check and an assignment, and Nicole was recalculating with incomplete information. That last part was my favorite. 4 days into the new year. Pamela called me at 8:15 the morning. Nicole filed a quitclaim deed attempt with the Maricopa County Recorder's Office yesterday afternoon. She said without preamble, I found out this morning through a monitoring flag I set on your property address when we opened the matter. She's trying to transfer the house into joint ownership before we get the court to void the underlying documents. I set down my coffee cup. Can she do that? Not if we move in the next few hours. A quitclaim deed requires a valid power of attorney to execute on someone else's behalf. And her power of attorney is the document we're contesting. But the recorder's office processes filings chronologically. If it goes through before our challenge is on record, we have a bigger problem. A pause. I'm filing an emergency list pendens right now. That's a legal notice that places an active dispute on record with the property. Once it's filed, no title transfer. No sale. No encumbrance on that property can proceed until the litigation is resolved. How long does that take to process? It'll be on record by noon. The quitclaim attempt will be blocked. Her voice was even, but had an undertone of the focused energy people get when they are working against a clock they intend to beat. Raymond. She moved fast. She knew about our representation letter. That's why she accelerated the deed filing. She's trying to get ahead of the court process. She's been trying to get ahead since Christmas morning. Well, she won't get ahead of this. Another pause. I'll call you when the list pendens is confirmed. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Through the window, I could see the backyard, the dry garden, the 2 palm trees along the back fence, the patio furniture I'd bought 6 years ago and kept because it was well made. And there was no reason to replace things that still worked. 740美元. Ling ling ling. That's what the county had assessed this property at. Nicole had been living in it for 2 years without paying $1 of rent. Now she was trying to claim ownership of it while the man whose name was on the deed was standing in the kitchen making coffee. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Almost. David came downstairs around 9:00. He had the look of someone who had not slept particularly well and was not planning to improve matters by eating anything. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter. Nicole talked to a lawyer. He said eventually, I assumed she would. Mark Taylor. Taylor and Bright. He turned the mug in his hands. He's filing something today. A letter saying you need to stop interfering. I considered this. With what? Specifically, David looked uncomfortable in the way he always did when asked to be precise about something Nicole had explained to him. With the documents, the management of the estate. The estate. I let that word sit for a moment. David. I'm 68 years old. And in good health. I have a consulting income, a pension, a house, and an investment account. This is not an estate. It's a life. Mine. I set my cup in the sink. Tell Mr. Taylor's client to check her filing with the recorder's office around noon. She'll find something interesting there. David frowned. What does that mean? It means information travels faster than paperwork. Sometimes. I picked up my jacket from the hook. I have a call with a client in Tucson. I'll be back by 3:00. Pamela called me at 1240, filed and confirmed. She said, the list pendens is on record as of 1152. The quitclaim attempt is blocked. Their attorney received our formal response to his letter about 40 minutes ago. A brief pause. His letter accused you of obstructing lawful estate management. My response noted that the underlying power of attorney contains a non-existent notary certification, that the capacity assessment was signed by a physician employed at the same facility as the purported authorized representative, and that the signatory was demonstrably not present for the examination on the date listed. She paused again. I concluded with, your client's position is not supported by the law or the facts. We advise immediate withdrawal of all contested instruments. Further filings will be met with a motion for sanctions. How did Mr. Taylor respond? He hasn't yet. I expect he'll call Nicole before he calls us. When I got home that afternoon, the house had a specific atmosphere, not loud, but pressurized, the way air feels before a storm that hasn't broken yet. David's car was in the driveway at an angle that suggested it had been parked quickly. The kitchen light was on. Nicole was at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a legal pad covered in handwriting beside it. She looked up when I came in. For a fraction of a second, just a fraction, something moved across her face that I had not seen there before. Not panic. Not yet. But the early cousin of panic. The recognition that the situation had developed beyond the version she had planned for. Then it was gone, replaced by the expression she used when she was managing a conversation. Your attorney sent Mark Taylor a letter. She said, attorneys communicate. That's what they do. She used the word sanctions. She's thorough. Nicole closed the laptop slowly, deliberately. In the way people close things when they want to demonstrate control they are working to maintain. Raymond. This doesn't have to be adversarial. We were trying to make sure. I was legally incapacitated. My bank accounts were accessible, and my house was in joint ownership. I set my keys on the hook by the door. I've read the documents. Nicole. Multiple times. I'm clear on what they were trying to accomplish. She was silent for a moment. Behind her, through the doorway to the living room, I could see David standing very still with his arms crossed, looking at that same middle-distance spot, the patch of floor and air that had become his default location whenever the room required something he wasn't prepared to give. The recorder's office blocked the deed filing. She said, a statement, not an accusation, les peines. I said, standard procedure when there's active litigation on a property. Your attorney should have mentioned that as a risk. Her jaw tightened slightly. Not much. Just enough to see if you were paying attention. I was paying attention. What do you want? Raymond. I looked at her for a long moment. I want what's mine. I said, I've always wanted what's mine. The difference is that now I have an attorney, a court filing, and a very clear picture of what was done and how. I picked up the newspaper from the counter. Sleep well. I went upstairs. That night, around 1:00, my phone showed a text from Brad Coleman. 7 words. Something interesting on Messer in the billing records. I stared at it for a moment. Then I wrote back, call me tomorrow morning. I set the phone face down on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and looked at the ceiling in the dark. Outside the window, the Scottsdale sky was clear enough that I could see the shape of Orion through the glass, low on the western horizon, exactly where my chart said it would be. Whatever Brad Coleman had found, it could wait until morning. Some things are worth sitting with overnight. Brad Coleman called me on a Tuesday morning about 2.5 weeks after I'd handed him the check and the assignment. I was in the garage recalibrating the declination axis on the telescope mount when the phone rang, a task that requires both hands and complete concentration, which meant I set it down and called him back from the kitchen table, where I could take notes. I have 47 pages, he said. You want the summary or the full walkthrough? Summary first. Then the details. He talked for 11 minutes without stopping. I wrote in my observation journal, the same black notebook, the same table, and by the time he was done, I had filled 2.5 pages with numbers, dates, names, and a column of annotations I made for myself about what each item meant in the larger picture. Here is what Brad Coleman had found. Dr. Craig Messer had been submitting insurance claims to 2 carriers, a regional health insurer, and a supplemental Medicare plan, for cognitive assessment examinations that had not been conducted. The billing code used was for a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation, typically a 2 to 3 hour procedure that generates a detailed written report. The claims showed the evaluations occurring at Sonoran Wellness Center on scheduled appointment dates. The supporting documentation was sparse in ways that a careful auditor would notice, but a routine claims processor would not. The scheme had been running for 14 months. Nicole Forrester, as the clinic's administrator, was the person who processed the billing submissions. She was also, in at least some cases, the person who had generated the patient intake records that appeared in the supporting documentation. Brad had found this through a combination of publicly accessible clinic records, cross-referenced appointment logs obtained through a contact at one of the insurance carriers, and a comparison of document metadata that showed the intake files for several patients had been created and modified from the same administrative workstation. Total payout from the 2 carriers over 14 months. Saint-Chabamayuan. Sube. I was not the first patient whose name had appeared in a fraudulent assessment. Brad had identified 3 others. All older adults. All with some degree of documented cognitive concern in their legitimate medical histories, which made them plausible candidates for the billing code being used. In my case, there was no legitimate medical history of cognitive concern. which was why my assessment had required the additional fabrication of a physician's signature and a non-existent notary certification. I was the outlier. The scheme had been built for patients who were already being seen at the clinic. Using it against someone who had never been a patient there required improvisation, and improvisation produces errors. 3 specific errors. To be exact, I'd found all 3 of them sitting at my desk on Christmas night. I thanked Brad, asked him to send me the full report as a secured PDF, and told him I would send the final payment for his time within the week. His hours had come to 19 total at $200 each. 100 yuan. 800 on top of the $2. 000. I'd paid up front. 500 yuan. 800 for 47 pages that were about to create a significant number of problems for 2 specific people. That afternoon, I drove to Pamela's office. I handed her a printed copy of the report, the flash drive with the original document scans, and my observation notebook opened to the 2.5 pages of notes from Coleman's call. She read for 20 minutes while I sat across from her desk. Her expression didn't change much while she read, but she underlined things twice on 2 separate pages, which I had noticed was something she did when she found a detail particularly significant. When she finished, she set the report down and looked at me. "This isn't just your case anymore," she said. "No, it isn't. 3 additional victims. A 1-4-month pattern. 2 insurance carriers. And an administrator who was running the billing." She tapped the report. "This crosses out of civil territory. This is insurance fraud under Arizona statute. R. S. Section 20 à 466. It's also potentially elder financial abuse, which carries separate enhancements." She paused. "I want to send a copy of this to 2 places simultaneously. The Arizona Department of Insurance, which has an insurance fraud enforcement division, and the Attorney General's Healthcare Fraud Unit. Those are the offices with criminal referral authority." "That's exactly what I want." She nodded. "I'll also attach it to our special action filing as supplemental evidence on the medical board complaint. It goes to the credibility of Dr. Messer's assessment. A physician who has been systematically submitting fraudulent claims is not a credible author of a capacity determination." I signed the authorization for the supplemental submissions that afternoon. By the time I drove home through the early evening traffic on Camelback Road, 2 separate government offices in Phoenix had received 47 pages of documented insurance fraud, complete with patient names, billing dates, claim amounts, and the administrative workstation records that placed Nicole at the center of the processing chain. David and Nicole were both home when I got back. They were in the living room, and the conversation stopped when I came through the door. The abrupt silence of people who were discussing something they did not intend for me to hear. He hung up my jacket, said good evening to the general direction of the living room, and went to the kitchen to make dinner. They still thought this was about the documents, about the power of attorney, and the lis pendens, and their attorney's letter. They didn't know yet that the paperwork they'd handed me on Christmas morning had become the loose thread in something much larger. That was fine. They'd find out, about a week later. I was making coffee when Nicole's phone rang. She answered in the kitchen, and I was close enough to hear the first few seconds before she moved to the hallway. A professional voice. Formal. Identifying an office. I didn't hear the full name of the office. I didn't need to. The tone of Nicole's voice in the 3 seconds before she stepped out of the room told me enough. The calls had started. The court hearing was scheduled for a morning in late February. In a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Maricopa County Judicial Building on Washington Street in downtown Phoenix. I had been to courtrooms before, mostly as a consultant providing expert testimony in business valuation disputes, but I had not previously been in one as the person whose legal status was under examination. It was a strange thing to sit at a table and know that the question before the court was informal language. Whether you possess the cognitive capacity to manage your own affairs. I had scored 29 out of 30 on the mini-mental state examination administered by an independent neuropsychologist appointed by the court 3 weeks earlier. The 1 point I lost was on a spatial orientation task involving the reproduction of a geometric figure, something I've never been particularly strong at, and which I mentioned to the neuropsychologist, who noted it without visible concern. She had also reviewed 4 months of my observation journal, which contained nightly astronomical entries with coordinate calculations, atmospheric condition assessments, and equipment calibration notes. Her written opinion was that the journal demonstrated quota, sustained attention, precise sequential reasoning, and consistent capacity for independent complex activity over an extended period. 29 out of 30. The irony being that the people who had declared me legally incapacitated were, between them, carrying $134, 0 inches credit card debt, 1 fraudulent insurance billing scheme, and a criminal investigation that had been active for several weeks by the time we walked into that courtroom. Pamela presented the 3 evidentiary points in the order she had planned: the conference attendance record that placed me in Tempe on the day the assessment claimed to have occurred, the non-existent notary certification number, and a summary of Brad Coleman's report on the billing practices at Sonoran Wellness Center. She connected the last point directly to Dr. Messer's credibility as an assessor, a physician whose billing records showed 14 months of fabricated examination claims was not a neutral medical authority. He was a participant in a documented fraud scheme, and the assessment he had signed for my case was consistent with the pattern of falsification that scheme employed. David's attorney, Mark Taylor from Taylor & Bright, did what he could. He argued that the conference attendance did not definitively preclude an examination on that date, that the clinic records might reflect a scheduling notation rather than an actual appointment time. He suggested that the notary certification issue was an administrative error that could be corrected through a subsequent filing. He tried to characterize Brad Coleman's report as speculation based on incomplete access to the clinic's internal records. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with the focused patience of someone who had heard many versions of the word administrative error, listened to all of it without visible reaction. Then she asked Mark Taylor one question. "Counsel, can you produce Dr. Messer to testify regarding the circumstances of the examination?" Taylor paused. "Dr. Messer is currently subject to a medical board inquiry, Your Honor. His counsel has advised him not to." "That answers my question," the judge said, and wrote something on the pad in front of her. I was sitting at Pamela's table, and I did not look at Nicole or David during this exchange. I didn't need to. I heard the small sound that David made, something between a breath and a word that didn't quite form, and from the corner of my eye, I saw his posture change, not a collapse, but a subsidence, the kind of physical change that happens when a person has been holding tension in their body for a long time and the structure that was justifying the tension is no longer there. Nicole did not make a sound. She sat to David's left with her hands on the table, and her expression arranged into the version of composure she had been wearing for 2 months. But she was looking at the judge, not at Taylor, and the angle of her jaw had the quality of a calculation that was running and not finding a resolution. The judge announced a recess and indicated she would issue her ruling within 6 weeks. We walked out of the courtroom into the corridor, and Pamela turned to me immediately. "That went well." The question about Messer's availability was significant. It tells you where her thinking is. I noticed. Taylor will try to file something in the interim, a motion to delay. Probably. Or a request for an independent review of the insurance fraud evidence on the grounds that it's prejudicial. She adjusted the folder under her arm. "I'll be ready for it." We took the elevator down. In the lobby, I held the door for a woman with a stroller, stepped out into the February Phoenix morning. 64 degrees. Clear. The downtown buildings throwing sharp-edged shadows across Jefferson Street, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before walking to the parking structure. 3 days after the hearing, Mark Taylor filed a motion to suppress Brad Coleman's report from the court record, on the grounds that the information had been obtained through an unlicensed investigative method, his argument being that certain records Coleman had accessed required formal legal process to obtain. Pamela filed a response within 48 hours, attaching Coleman's Arizona private investigator license, a declaration from Coleman describing his methodology, and a legal memorandum citing 3 Arizona appellate decisions establishing the admissibility of independently gathered documentary evidence in civil capacity proceedings. Taylor's motion was denied. It was also around this time that Nicole stopped speaking to me entirely, not in a dramatic way. There was no announcement, no confrontation. She simply stopped. If we were in the same room, she looked through me. If I said something in passing, She didn't respond. It was the silence of a person who had decided that engagement was a liability and that the most controlled position was no position at all. David, meanwhile, had begun to look at me differently, not with warmth. We were past warmth, and I wasn't looking for it, but with something closer to apprehension, like a person who has just fully read a contract they signed several months ago and was working through the implications. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter the way he did when he had something to say and hadn't yet decided whether to say it. I poured myself water and waited. She hasn't told me everything. Has she? He said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him for a moment. David, I've been sitting at this table for 2 months watching your wife operate. I know what I know. What she's told you is between the two of you. He nodded slowly and said nothing more. But the look on his face when he walked out of the kitchen, the look of a man who had been adding numbers that didn't sum to what he was told they would, stayed with me. 6 weeks. The judge had said. By the time those 6 weeks ended, the Arizona Attorney General's Healthcare Fraud Unit had confirmed receipt of Coleman's report and opened a formal inquiry. The medical board had upgraded its inquiry on Dr. Messer from administrative review to active disciplinary proceeding, and Pamela had received a communication from Mark Taylor's office, indicating that his firm was reconsidering its engagement with the matter. The ruling was coming. Everything else was already in motion. I drove home from Pamela's office that afternoon along the 202, the Superstition Mountains visible to the east under a sky that was the specific clear blue you only get in the desert in winter. I turned off the radio and drove in silence, thinking about what the judge would say, and what came after that, and what the house on Cactus Road would feel like when there were only one set of footsteps in it again. I thought it would feel like mine. The judge's ruling came on a Tuesday morning in mid-April. 6 weeks after the hearing, exactly when she had said it would. Pamela called me at 9:47. I was at my desk reviewing a client proposal when the phone rang. I set the papers down and picked it up. She said 3 words before anything else. We won everything. She read me the ruling in full. All 3 contested instruments, the durable power of attorney, the capacity assessment signed by Dr. Craig Messer, and the quitclaim deed submission to the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, were declared void and without legal effect. The court's reasoning cited the non-existent notary certification, the documented absence of the subject on the date of the alleged examination, and what the judge described as the inherent lack of independence between the certifying physician and the individual who purported to act as authorized representative. The lis pendens was lifted. The dispute resolved in my favor. The ruling was being entered into the public record of Maricopa County that same afternoon. I thanked Pamela. Then I sat at my desk and looked out the window. At the Scottsdale backyard, the palm trees along the fence, the dry garden, the patio furniture that was still solid after 6 years of Arizona sun, 740美元. Ling ling ling, 460美元. 0 inches the investment account. Mine. Unambiguously. Legally. Publicly mine as of that Tuesday morning. I made coffee and went back to work. What happened over the following weeks arrived the way consequences usually do. Not as a single dramatic event, but as a sequence of developments, each following logically from the one before. The Medical Board of Arizona suspended Dr. San Messer's license to practice medicine pending completion of its disciplinary proceedings. The notice appeared in the board's public online registry with a status flag that read, "License suspended. Active disciplinary proceeding." I know this because I checked. The clinic at 1380 West Thomas Road went quiet after that. I drove past it once, not out of any particular intention. It was on the route to a client meeting, and the parking lot had noticeably fewer cars than I remembered from the one time I had looked up its address months earlier. Then, about 3 weeks after the court ruling, the Arizona Attorney General's office filed criminal charges. Pamela sent me the filing summary by email. Insurance fraud under A.R. S. Section 20 à 466. The statute covers the submission of false or fraudulent claims to an insurer, which is precisely what Messer and Nicole had been doing for 14 months. The filing listed multiple counts across the 2 insurance carriers. There was also a separate charge related to the falsification of medical records, the fabricated capacity assessments, including the one created for me, and the similar documents created for the three other patients Brad Coleman had identified, Nicole Forster and Dr. Craig Messer, were named as co-defendants. Mark Taylor had already quietly withdrawn from the matter 2 weeks before the charges were filed. A professionally managed exit. That was probably the most sensible decision anyone on the other side had made throughout this entire situation. Without Taylor, and with the underlying documents voided by the court, David had no legal representation and no legal position. He came to the house on a weekday afternoon about a week after the charges were filed. I heard his car in the driveway, then his knock. I opened the door and stepped outside onto the front step rather than inviting him in. The afternoon was warm. The sun already past the roofline and heading west. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had recently been informed he would be carrying it for considerably longer. The hair at his temples had more gray than I remembered from Christmas morning. "Dad," he said. I waited. I didn't know the full scope of what Nicole had done. "What about the billing? The other patients?" He paused. "I knew about the documents. I agreed to the documents. I want to be honest about that. I know. But I didn't know about the insurance scheme. I didn't know there were other people." He looked at the ground, then back up. "That's not an excuse." I looked at my son, 38 years old, unemployed, 134美元, 0 inches personal debt, and married to a woman now facing criminal prosecution. He had made a choice on Christmas morning, a clear-eyed, deliberate choice, and that choice had produced these consequences. That was the arithmetic of it, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "I gave you 22 years of something real," I said. "You took that and turned it into a transaction." I held his gaze, not with cruelty, but with the absolute clarity of a man who had done exactly what needed to be done and was at peace with every step of it. "You decided I was done. You decided the board was clear and the pieces were yours to move. You forgot to check whether I was still playing." I went inside, came back with the envelope Pamela had prepared, formal letterhead, addressed to both David and Nicole Forster, 60 days notice to vacate the premises at 4817 East Cactus Road, Scottsdale. He took it. He looked at the envelope without opening it. "You have 60 days. I said. "Use them." I went back inside and closed the door. The 60 days passed unevenly. Some days moving, others standing still. David and Nicole were quiet in the house. Not the pressurized quiet of the weeks after Christmas, but the flattened quiet of two people who had run out of moves and knew it. Nicole's criminal defense attorney had apparently advised her to avoid any actions that could be construed as aggravating. She complied. She was in the house. And then, over the course of those 60 days, she was less in the house. And then she was gone. I learned later that she had moved in with her sister in Tempe sometime in the 5th week. I noticed her absence the way you notice when a sound that has been present for a long time stops. Not as relief. Exactly. But as a return to baseline, David stayed until the last week. He packed methodically, which I respected, and he did not leave the house in a state that required anything from me. On the final day, I was in the garage when the moving truck arrived. A rented van, mid-size, the kind you drive yourself. I heard the loading through the wall, footsteps, the sound of boxes, doors closing, about 2 hours of it, then silence. I came out to the front of the house. The van was in the driveway, and David was making one more trip from upstairs. He came down with a lamp and a duffel bag, walked to the van, put them in the back, and stood beside the open cargo door for a moment, looking at the house the way people look at things they know they are seeing for the last time. He turned and looked at me. I looked back. There was nothing useful left to say, and I have never been a man who fills space with words when the silence is more accurate. He nodded once. I nodded back. He closed the cargo door, got into the cab, and drove down Cactus Road until I couldn't see him anymore. I stood on the front step in the October morning, 81 degrees, dry, and thought about nothing in particular for about 2 minutes. Then I went inside. 3 weeks later, the criminal proceedings produced their first formal outcomes. Nicole accepted a plea agreement, 3 years of supervised probation, a fine of $42. Ling ling ling. Representing the combined restitution to the two insurance carriers and the court-assessed penalty, and a permanent prohibition on employment in any licensed medical or healthcare administrative capacity. Dr. Craig Messer accepted similar terms: 18 months of probation, permanent revocation of his medical license, and restitution payments to the carriers. His license was formally revoked and entered into the permanent public record of the Arizona Medical Board. David was not charged. His name appeared in the evidentiary record as a person present when the fraudulent documents were presented to me, and who had signed as a witness on the power of attorney, which was void. But the Attorney General's office had focused its prosecution on the insurance fraud, where his role was that of intended beneficiary rather than active operator. He knew that distinction was narrow. I suspected he would be aware of it for some time. That same week, I drove to Pamela's office on Central Avenue for the last time as an active client. Her final billing summary totaled $23. Babe, I wrote the check without comment. It was a fair number for what she had accomplished. Most satisfying case I've had in 3 years. She said when I handed it to her, for me as well. I said, though my baseline for comparison is somewhat different. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Brad Coleman's final invoice came to $4. $200 for the full 19 hours of his investigation. I paid it by bank transfer the same afternoon. Without his 47 pages, the insurance fraud would have remained invisible. The medical board complaint would have had no structural support, and the criminal prosecution would not have happened. A conference badge and a registration ticket had started all of this. 47 pages, and one careful man with a license and a notepad had finished it. Total cost of getting my life back: Arshabame yuan. Ling ling ling. Total assets secured: Ime yuan. Lambe. Ling ling ling. The arithmetic was not complicated. That evening, I went to the garage. I uncovered the Celestron Nexstar, checked the alignment I had recalibrated in January. Still accurate, the way things are when they're built well and maintained, and carried the observation journal to the kitchen table. I opened it to a fresh page. The previous entry was from the week before Christmas, when I had recorded a clear observation of the Orion Nebula with unusually good atmospheric transparency. I had been meaning to continue the log for 10 months. I'd been somewhat occupied. I wrote the current date. Sky conditions: clear. Humidity at 11%. No moon. Then the coordinates of the star I had planned to observe in December and had not gotten around to. I made coffee, took it to the back patio, and sat in the chair that had survived 6 Arizona summers without needing to be replaced. The sky above Scottsdale was doing what it does on a clear October night, demonstrating with considerable conviction exactly how many stars exist if you are willing to look. I found Orion low in the east. I found the Pleiades above it. I found the faint smear of the Andromeda Galaxy, 2.5 million light-years away. Visible to the naked eye if you know where to look, and you're patient enough to let your eyes adjust. Someone had once decided that my eyes were no longer capable of adjusting, that my mind had gone soft and slow, that I was a resource to be managed rather than a person capable of managing his own affairs. They had been wrong about that. Comprehensively, documentably, legally wrong. A matter of public record in Maricopa County, Arizona, in a ruling that would remain accessible to anyone who cared to search it. I sat on my patio, in my house, on my sky, with my coffee, and my notebook, and the particular satisfaction of a man who had settled every account that needed settling and still had time left to watch the stars. The score. For anyone keeping track, they arrived with a forged document and a plan. I arrived with patience, a private investigator, and an attorney who charged $250 an hour and was worth every cent of it. Some games look finished before they're finished. That's the thing about checking the board before you declare the other side the winner. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to a few stories there. You can find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video, or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel may soon cease to exist.